In fact, this resolution simply reaffirms statements made by the Security Council on the legality of settlements over several decades. It does not break new ground. In 1978, the State Department legal advisor advised the Congress of his conclusion that the Israeli government's program of establishing civilian settlements in the occupied territory is inconsistent with international law. And we see no change since then to affect that fundamental conclusion. Now, you may have heard that some criticize this resolution for calling East Jerusalem occupied territory. But to be clear, there was absolutely nothing new in last week's resolution on that issue. It was one of a long line of Security Council resolutions that included East Jerusalem as part of the territories occupied by Israel in 1967, and that includes resolutions passed by the Security Council under President Reagan and President George H.W. Bush. And remember that every U.S. administration since 1967, along with the entire international community, has recognized East Jerusalem as among the territories that Israel occupied in the Six-Day War. Now, I want to stress this point. We fully respect Israel's profound historic and religious ties to the city and to its holy sites. We've never questioned that. This resolution in no manner prejudges the outcome of permanent status negotiations on East Jerusalem, which must, of course, reflect those historic ties and the realities on the ground. That's our position. We still support it. We also strongly reject the notion that somehow the United States was the driving force behind this resolution. The Egyptians and Palestinians had long made clear to all of us, to all of the international community, their intention to bring a resolution to a vote before the end of the year. And we communicated that to the Israelis, and they knew it anyway. The United States did not draft or originate this resolution, nor did we put it forward. It was drafted by Egypt. It was drafted and, I think, introduced by Egypt, which is one of Israel's closest friends in the region, in coordination with the Palestinians and others. And during the time of the process, as it went out, we made clear to others, including those on the Security Council, that it was possible that if the resolution were to be balanced and it were to include references to incitement and to terrorism, that it was possible the United States would then not block it, that if it was balanced and fair. That's a standard practice with resolutions at the Security Council. The Egyptians and the Palestinians and many others understood that if the text were more balanced, it was possible we wouldn't block it. But we also made crystal clear that the President of the United States would not make a final decision about our own position until we saw the final text. In the end, we did not agree with every word in this resolution. There are important issues that are not sufficiently addressed or even addressed at all. But we could not in good conscience veto a resolution that condemns violence and incitement and reiterates what has been for a long time the overwhelming consensus and international view on settlements, and calls for the parties to start taking constructive steps to advance the two-state solution on the ground. Ultimately, it will be up to the Israeli people to decide whether the unusually heated attacks that Israeli officials have directed towards this administration best serve Israel's national interests and its relationship with an ally that has been steadfast in its support, as I described. Those attacks, alongside allegations of U.S.-led conspiracy and other manufactured claims, distract attention from what the substance of this vote was really all about. And we all understand that Israel faces very serious threats in a very tough neighborhood. Israelis are rightfully concerned about making sure that there is not a new terrorist haven right next door to them, often referencing what's happened with Gaza. And we understand that. and we believe there are ways to meet those needs of security. And Israelis are fully justified in decrying attempts to legitimize their state and question the right of a Jewish state to exist. But this vote was not about that. It was about actions that Israelis and Palestinians are taking that are increasingly rendering a two-state solution impossible. It was not about making peace with the Palestinians now. It was about making sure that peace with the Palestinians will be possible in the future. Now, we all understand that Israel faces extraordinarily serious threats in a very tough neighborhood. And Israelis are very correct in making sure that there's not a terrorist haven right on their border. But this vote, I can't emphasize it enough, is not about the possibility of arriving at an agreement that's going to resolve that overnight or in 1 year or 2 years. This is about a longer process. This is about how we make peace with the Palestinians in the future, but preserve the capacity to do so. So how do we get there? How do we get there to that peace? Since the parties have not yet been able to resume talks, the U.S. and the Middle East Quartet have repeatedly called on both sides to independently demonstrate a genuine commitment to the two-state solution, not just with words, but with real actions and policies to create the conditions for meaningful negotiations. We've called for both sides to take significant steps on the ground to reverse current trends and send a different message, a clear message, that they are prepared to fundamentally change the equation without waiting for the other side to act. We have pushed them to comply with their basic commitments under their own prior agreements in order to advance a two-state reality on the ground. We have called for the Palestinians to do everything in their power to stop violence and incitement, including publicly and consistently condemning acts of terrorism and stopping the glorification of violence. And we have called on them to continue efforts to strengthen their own institutions and to improve governance, transparency, and accountability. And we have stressed that the Hamas arms buildup and militant activities in Gaza must stop. Along with our quartet partners, we have called on Israel to end the policy of settlement construction and expansion, of taking land for exclusive Israeli use and denying Palestinian development. To reverse the current process, the U.S. and our partners have encouraged Israel to resume the transfer of greater civil authority to the Palestinians in Area C, consistent with the transition that was called for by Oslo. And we have made clear that significant progress across a range of sectors, including housing, agriculture, and natural resources, can be made without negatively impacting Israel's legitimate security needs. And we've called for significantly easing the movement and access restrictions to and from Gaza, with due consideration for Israel's need to protect its citizens from terrorist attacks. So let me stress here again, none of the steps that I just talked about would negatively impact Israel's security. Let me also emphasize, this is not about offering limited economic measures that perpetuate the status quo. We're talking about significant steps that would signal real progress towards creating two states. That's the bottom line. If we're serious about the two-state solution, it's time to start implementing it now. Advancing the process of separation now in a serious way could make a significant difference in saving the two-state solution and in building confidence in the citizens of both sides that peace is indeed possible. And much progress can be made in advance of negotiations that can lay the foundation for negotiations, as contemplated by the Oslo process. In fact, these steps will help create the conditions for successful talks. Now, in the end, we all understand that a final status agreement can only be achieved through direct negotiations between the parties. We've said that again and again. We cannot impose the peace. There are other countries in the UN who believe it is our job to dictate the terms of a solution in the Security Council. Others want us to simply recognize a Palestinian state, absent an agreement. But I want to make clear today, these are not the choices that we will make. We choose instead to draw on the experiences of the last 8 years, to provide a way forward when the parties are ready for serious negotiations, in a place where the narratives from the past powerfully inform and mold the present. It's important to understand the history. We mark this year and next a series of milestones that I believe both illustrate the two sides of the conflict and form the basis for its resolution. It's worth touching on them briefly. 120 years ago, the first Zionist Congress was convened in Basel by a group of Jewish visionaries who decided that the only effective response to the waves of anti-Semitic horrors sweeping across Europe was to create a state in the historic home of the Jewish people, where their ties to the land went back centuries, a state that could defend its borders, protect its people, and live in peace with its neighbors. That was the vision. That was the modern beginning, and it remains the dream of Israel today. Nearly 70 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181 finally paved the way to making the State of Israel a reality. The concept was simple: to create two states for two peoples, one Jewish, one Arab, to realize the national aspirations of both Jews and Palestinians. And both Israel and the PLO referenced Resolution 181 in their respective declarations of independence. The United States recognized Israel 7 minutes after its creation, but the Palestinians and the Arab world did not. And from its birth, Israel had to fight for its life. Palestinians also suffered terribly in the 1948 war, including many who had lived for generations in a land that had long been their home too. And when Israel celebrates its 70th anniversary in 2018, the Palestinians will mark a very different anniversary, 70 years since what they call the Nakba, or catastrophe. Next year will also mark 50 years since the end of the Six-Day War, when Israel again fought for its survival. And Palestinians will again mark just the opposite, 50 years of military occupation. Both sides have accepted UN Security Council Resolution 242, which called for the withdrawal of Israel from territory that it occupied in 1967 in return for peace and secure borders as the basis for ending the conflict. It has been more than 20 years since Israel and the PLO signed their first agreement, the Oslo Accords, and the PLO formally recognized Israel. Both sides committed to a plan to transition much of the West Bank and Gaza to Palestinian control during permanent status negotiations that would put an end to their conflict. Unfortunately, neither the transition nor the final agreement came about, and both sides bear responsibility for that. Finally, some 15 years ago, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia came out with a historic Arab peace initiative, which offered fully normalized relations with Israel when it made peace. An enormous opportunity then and now, which has never been fully embraced. That history was critical to our approach to trying to find a way to resolve the conflict. And based on my experience with both sides over the last 4 years, including the 9 months of formal negotiations, the core issues can be resolved if there is leadership on both sides committed to finding a solution. In the end, I believe the negotiations did not fail because the gaps were too wide, but because the level of trust was too low. Both sides were concerned that any concessions would not be reciprocated and would come at too great a political cost. And the deep public skepticism only made it more difficult for them to be able to take risks. In the countless hours that we spent working on a detailed framework, we worked through numerous formulations and developed specific bridging proposals, and we came away with a clear understanding of the fundamental needs of both sides. In the past 2.5 years, I have tested ideas with regional and international stakeholders, including our quartet partners. And I believe what has emerged from all of that is a broad consensus on balanced principles that would satisfy the core needs of both sides. President Clinton deserves great credit for laying out extensive parameters designed to bridge gaps in advanced final status negotiations 16 years ago. Today, with mistrust too high to even start talks, we're at the opposite end of the spectrum. Neither side is willing to even risk acknowledging the other's bottom line. And more negotiations that do not produce progress will only reinforce the worst fears. Now, everyone understands that negotiations would be complex and difficult, and nobody can be expected to agree on the final result in advance. But if the parties could at least demonstrate that they understand the other side's most basic needs and are potentially willing to meet them if theirs are also met at the end of comprehensive negotiations, perhaps then enough trust could be established to enable a meaningful progress to begin. It is in that spirit that we offer the following principles: not to prejudge or impose an outcome, but to provide a possible basis for serious negotiations when the parties are ready. Now, individual countries may have more detailed policies on these issues, as we do, by the way. But I believe there is a broad consensus that a final status agreement that could meet the needs of both sides would do the following. Principle number one: provide for secure and recognized international borders between Israel and a viable and contiguous Palestine, negotiated based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed equivalent swaps. Resolution 242, which has been enshrined in international law for 50 years, provides for the withdrawal of Israel from territory it occupied in 1967 in return for peace with its neighbors and secure and recognized borders. It has long been accepted by both sides, and it remains the basis for an agreement today. As Secretary, one of the first issues that I worked out with the Arab League was their agreement that the reference in the Arab Peace Initiative to the 1967 lines would from now on include the concept of land swaps, which the Palestinians have acknowledged. And this is necessary to reflect practical realities on the ground and mutually agreed equivalent swaps that will ensure that the agreement is fair to both sides. There is also broad recognition of Israel's need to ensure that the borders are secure and defensible, and that the territory of Palestine is viable and contiguous. Virtually everyone that I have spoken to has been clear on this principle as well. No changes by Israel to the 1967 lines will be recognized by the international community unless agreed to by both sides. Principle two: fulfill the vision of the UN General Assembly Resolution 181 of 2 states for 2 peoples, one Jewish and one Arab, with mutual recognition and full equal rights for all their respective citizens. This has been the fundamental, foundational principle of the 2-state solution from the beginning. Creating a state for the Jewish people and a state for the Palestinian people where each can achieve their national aspirations. And Resolution 181 is incorporated into the foundational documents of both the Israelis and Palestinians. Recognition of Israel as a Jewish state has been the U.S. position for years, and based on my conversations in these last months, I am absolutely convinced that many others are now prepared to accept it as well, provided the need for a Palestinian state is also addressed. We also know that there are some 1.7 million Arab citizens who call Israel their home and must now and always be able to live as equal citizens, which makes this a difficult issue for Palestinians and others in the Arab world. That's why it is so important that in recognizing each other's homeland, Israel for the Jewish people and Palestine for the Palestinian people, both sides reaffirm their commitment to upholding full equal rights for all of their respective citizens. Principle number 3, provide for a just, agreed, fair, and realistic solution to the Palestinian refugee issue, with international assistance that includes compensation, options and assistance in finding permanent homes, acknowledgement of suffering, and other measures necessary for a comprehensive resolution consistent with 2 states for 2 peoples. The plight of many Palestinian refugees is heartbreaking, and all agree that their needs have to be addressed. As part of a comprehensive resolution, they must be provided with compensation, their suffering must be acknowledged, and there will be a need to have options and assistance in finding permanent homes. The international community can provide significant support and assistance. I know we are prepared to do that, including in raising money to help ensure the compensation and other needs of the refugees are met. And many have expressed a willingness to contribute to that effort, particularly if it brings peace. But there is a general recognition that the solution must be consistent with 2 states for 2 peoples and cannot affect the fundamental character of Israel. Principle 4, provide an agreed resolution for Jerusalem as the internationally recognized capital of the 2 states and protect and assure freedom of access to the holy sites consistent with the established status quo. Now, Jerusalem is the most sensitive issue for both sides, and the solution will have to meet the needs not only of the parties, but of all 3 monotheistic faiths. That is why the holy sites that are sacred to billions of people around the world must be protected and remain accessible, and the established status quo maintained. Most acknowledge that Jerusalem should not be divided again like it was in 1967, and we believe that. At the same time, there is broad recognition that there will be no peace agreement without reconciling the basic aspirations of both sides to have capitals there. Principle 5, satisfy Israel's security needs and bring a full end, ultimately, to the occupation, while ensuring that Israel can defend itself effectively and that Palestine can provide security for its people in a sovereign and non-militarized state. Security is the fundamental issue for Israel, together with a couple of others I've mentioned, but security is critical. Everyone understands that no Israeli government can ever accept an agreement that does not satisfy its security needs, or that risks creating an enduring security threat like Gaza transferred to the West Bank. And Israel must be able to defend itself effectively, including against terrorism and other regional threats. In fact, there is a real willingness by Egypt, Jordan, and others to work together with Israel on meeting key security challenges. And I believe that those collective efforts, including close coordination on border security, intelligence sharing, joint cooperations, joint operation, can all play a critical role in securing the peace. At the same time, fully ending the occupation is the fundamental issue for the Palestinians. They need to know that the military occupation itself will really end after an agreed transitional process. They need to know they can live in freedom and dignity in a sovereign state while providing security for their population, even without a military of their own. This is widely accepted as well. And it is important to understand there are many different ways without occupation for Israel and Palestine and Jordan and Egypt and the United States and others to cooperate in providing that security. Now, balancing those requirements was among the most important challenges that we face in the negotiations. But it was one where the United States has the ability to provide the most assistance. And that is why a team that was led by General John Allen, who is here, for whom I am very grateful for his many hours of effort, along with, he is one of our foremost military minds, and dozens of experts from the Department of Defense and other agencies, all of them engaged extensively with the Israeli Defense Force in trying to find solutions that could help Israel address its legitimate security needs. They developed innovative approaches to creating unprecedented, multi-layered border security, enhancing Palestinian capacity, enabling Israel to retain the ability to address threats by itself, even when the occupation had ended. General Allen and his team were not suggesting one particular outcome or one particular timeline, nor were they suggesting that technology alone would resolve these problems. They were simply working on ways to support whatever the negotiators agreed to. And they did some very impressive work that gives me total confidence that Israel's security requirements can be met. Principle 6. End the conflict and all outstanding claims, enabling normalized relations and enhanced regional security for all, as envisaged by the Arab Peace Initiative. It is essential for both sides that the final status agreement resolves all the outstanding issues and finally brings closure to this conflict, so that everyone can move ahead to a new era of peaceful coexistence and cooperation. For Israel, this must also bring broader peace with all of its Arab neighbors. That is the fundamental promise of the Arab Peace Initiative, which key Arab leaders have affirmed in these most recent days. The Arab Peace Initiative also envisions enhanced security for all of the region. It envisages Israel being a partner in those efforts when peace is made. This is the area where Israel and the Arab world are looking at perhaps the greatest moment of potential transformation in the Middle East since Israel's creation in 1948. The Arab world faces its own set of security challenges. With Israeli-Palestinian peace, Israel, the United States, Jordan, Egypt, together with the GCC countries, would be ready and willing to define a new security partnership for the region that would be absolutely groundbreaking. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's why it is vital that we all work to keep open the possibility of peace, that we not lose hope in the two-state solution, no matter how difficult it may seem, because there really is no viable alternative. Now, we all know that a speech alone won't produce peace. But based on over 30 years of experience and the lessons from the past 4 years, I have suggested, I believe, and President Obama has signed on to and believes in, a path that the parties could take. Realistic steps on the ground now, consistent with the parties' own prior commitments, that will begin the process of separating into two states, a political horizon to work towards, to create the conditions for a successful final status talk, and a basis for negotiations that the parties could accept to demonstrate that they are serious about making peace. We can only encourage them to take this path. We cannot walk down it for them. But if they take these steps, peace would bring extraordinary benefits in enhancing the security and the stability and the prosperity of Israelis, Palestinians, all of the nations of the region. The Palestinian economy has amazing potential in the context of independence, with major private sector investment possibilities and a talented, hungry, eager to work young workforce. Israel's economy could enjoy unprecedented growth as it becomes a regional economic powerhouse, taking advantage of the unparalleled culture of innovation and trading opportunities with new Arab partners. Meanwhile, security challenges could be addressed by an entirely new security arrangement in which Israel cooperates openly with key Arab states. That is the future that everybody should be working for. President Obama and I know that the incoming administration has signaled that they may take a different path, and even suggested breaking from the long-standing U.S. policies on settlements, Jerusalem, and the possibility of a two-state solution. That is for them to decide. That's how we work. But we cannot, in good conscience, do nothing and say nothing when we see the hope of peace slipping away. This is a time to stand up for what is right. We have long known what two states living side by side in peace and security looks like. We should not be afraid to say so. Now, I really began to reflect on what we have learned and the way ahead when I recently joined President Obama in Jerusalem for the state funeral for Shimon Peres. Shimon was one of the founding fathers of Israel who became one of the world's great elder statesmen, a beautiful man. I was proud to call him my friend, and I know that President Obama was as well. And I remembered the first time that I saw Shimon in person, standing on the White House lawn for the signing of the historic Oslo Accords. And I thought about the last time at an intimate, one-on-one Shabbat dinner, just a few months before he died, when we toasted together to the future of Israel and to the peace that he still so passionately believed in for his people. He summed it up simply and eloquently as only Shimon could. Quote, "The original mandate gave the Palestinians 48%. Now it's down to 22%. I think 78% is enough for us." As we laid Shimon to rest that day, many of us couldn't help but wonder if peace between Israelis and Palestinians might also be buried along with one of its most eloquent champions. We cannot let that happen. There is simply too much at stake for future generations of Israelis and Palestinians to give in to pessimism, especially when peace is in fact still possible. We must not lose hope in the possibility of peace. We must not give in to those who say what is now must always be, that there is no chance for a better future. It is up to Israelis and Palestinians to make the difficult choices for peace, but we can all help. And for the sake of future generations of Israelis and Palestinians, for all the people of the region, for the United States, for all those around the world who have prayed for and worked for peace for generations, let's hope that we are all prepared, and particularly Israelis and Palestinians, to make those choices now. Thank you very much.
There you go. That's Secretary of State John Kerry just wrapping up a very long speech at the State Department, laying out this administration's vision for Middle East peace. He said time and time again that a two-state solution is the only path to peace, and he defended the United States' failure to veto the UN resolution last week condemning Jewish settlements in what some call the occupied territories. That failure ratcheting up tension between the U.S. and Israel as President Obama has just about 3 weeks left in his term. Here's Secretary Kerry just moments ago.
The two-state solution is the only way to achieve a just and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. It is the only way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state, living in peace and security with its neighbors. It is the only way to ensure a future of freedom and dignity for the Palestinian people, and it is an important way of advancing United States interests in the region.
Also, Secretary Kerry defending America's abstention at the UN last week, calling it a defense of American values. Listen.
Friends need to tell each other the hard truths, and friendships require mutual respect. I am compelled to respond today that the United States did, in fact, vote in accordance with our values, just as previous U.S. administrations have done at the Security Council before us.
All right, let's bring it out to the couch. Herman Cain, you had a lot to say during the speech.
Yes.
A lot to say because it was a very long speech.
Yes.
He obviously had two objectives here. Make the case to the American people and the world for the two-state solution in Israel, and also defend the U.S. in that abstention vote. Did he succeed on either front?
No. There's an old saying. When people don't agree with your conclusion, dazzle them with, I can't say it on the air, rhetoric. That's what this was. The only thing worse than a 1 hour plus speech by John Kerry is a 1 hour speech by President Obama. This is pure rhetoric to try to cover up for the flawed assumptions. Number one, the two-state solution. That is a flawed assumption. Why? Because when they had an agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis decades ago, the Palestinians were the first one to break that agreement that he talked about.
Yeah.
Secondly, security is the most important thing. If you demand that the occupied area be given to the Palestinians, Israel becomes a sitting duck. This is why Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israelis are simply not going to go along with that approach.
All right, so Dagan, let me ask you, I mean, obviously this is the white whale. This is the magnum opus. This is the gold medal for any president, is lasting peace in the Middle East. So is the president in his final weeks trying to actually craft some sort of peace there, or is this just some sort of needling against Israel for the bad relationship they've had over the two terms?
If the Obama administration wanted peace and wanted to protect Israel, they wouldn't have brokered that Iran deal and handed $1.7 billion in a cash ransom payment to the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, funding terrorists in Yemen, funding Hezbollah, and firing missiles, by the way, earlier this year that carried the Hebrew message, Israel must be wiped out. Let's not forget that. Why is this happening now? Why didn't it happen before now? Because of the politics. Because if Democrats had heard this speech and witnessed that abstention last week, they would have been, here's the slogan, according to Eli Lake, that you would have seen, can't stop genocide in Syria, and we make Jewish homes in Jerusalem illegal. 500,000 Syrians were killed, and that's what we get, the message to Israel. This is appalling what has happened.
All right, it certainly seems to have flamed the tensions just as we are coming off a presidential election in this country. And look at this. President-elect Donald Trump has tweeted. And you can see this tweet right here. In response before Kerry's speech, he wrote, "We cannot continue to let Israel be treated with such total disdain and disrespect. They used to have a great friend in the U.S., but not anymore. The beginning of the end was the horrible Iran deal," as Dagan alluded to. "And now this UN Stay Strong Israel January 20th is fast approaching." All right, so Lisa Booth, what can Israel expect from a changing of the guard in the White House, from a new administration that has grown to be very pro-Israel over the last few months?
I think an administration that supports our friends and not our enemies, which is not what we've seen under President Obama. And I think he's really going to go out a coward. He's going to go out a coward on the world stage, and as ambassador, and a coward that has made the world less safe, ultimately. And as Ambassador John Bolton wrote in the Wall Street Journal, this isn't stabbing Israel in the back, it's stabbing Israel in the front. And Secretary John Kerry said today that there has been no administration that has been a better friend to Israel, but that flies in the face of common sense, as Herman and Dagan have pointed out in this earlier segment. And that's also why I think you see Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said that this resolution is a declaration of war. Yeah. He said it's a shameful ambush by the President of the United States, and I absolutely agree with him.
All right, well, let's take a look at the at Benjamin Netanyahu's tweet, because he also had something to say. President-elect Trump, thank you for your warm friendship and clear-cut support for Israel. That's obviously a jab at the sitting president, who has not demonstrated clear-cut support for Israel.
No, and I'll tell you this. I don't think there's anything clear-cut about any of these things we're talking about. I just got back from Israel from 2 weeks ago, and I was there for a week, and I saw much in my time there. And I'll tell you this.
What are they saying about our election?
Well, look, I think they're optimistic, like many people are. President-elect Trump has been very consistent, I think, in his support of Israel, and I think that's a good thing. They're optimistic about that. But I want to talk about the two-state solution, because I think in theory, and we heard, John Kerry talk for over an hour about these, 6-point prongs. It's all great talk. It is rhetoric. Here's the problem.
Yeah.
In order for a real negotiation to take place, at least one common thing must be understood from day one, and that is a recognition of Israel's right to exist. And until that is, acknowledged, really in Arabic, by the Palestinian people, we can't move forward with this, right? Because that's the thing. Well, I actually sat down with Erekat, who is the chief negotiator from the Palestinian Authority, and he said a lot of good things that sound really good, but they are tying their hands. They are saying one thing out of their mouth. They're saying another thing to their actual people. And this is why we see the settlements. Now, I understand why the U.S. took the position. I do. But I am not mad at Israel for continuing with the settlements because of what you said, Herman. You said that they have to protect, their space and their right to exist. And we saw what happened with the Gaza Strip. They gave it up, and we saw what's happening there, Hamas and all. So this is something that's very complex.
Well, John Kerry compared the geography in the West Bank to Swiss cheese. Maybe could have spent a little bit more time editing the speech and beefing up the metaphors. All right, more potential fallout from Secretary John Kerry's tough language for Israel, the reaction from the Jewish state, and a live report from Jerusalem coming up on Outnumbered. This is a Fox News alert. Secretary of State John Kerry defending the U.S. refusal to block a UN resolution that called Israeli settlements a violation of international law. In a very long speech to the State Department, wrapping up a short while ago, Secretary Kerry said the UN vote was, quote, in accordance with American values, and that a two-state solution is the only way to achieve a secure Israel.
We cannot properly defend and protect Israel if we allow a viable two-state solution to be destroyed before our own eyes. And that's the bottom line. The vote in the United Nations was about preserving the two-state solution. That's what we were standing up for. Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state, living side by side in peace and security with its neighbors. That's what we are trying to preserve for our sake and for theirs.
The lady doth protest too much, methinks. John Huddy, live in Jerusalem with more. John?
Yeah, well, Kennedy, Secretary Kerry also said that President Obama has been Israel's greatest friend and supporter. Now, so far, we haven't heard any reaction from Israeli officials, in particular Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That will likely change, and hopefully we'll get something sooner rather than later. If we do, certainly I'll report it to you. But I think the takeaway, one of the important takeaways on this, are the principles that Secretary Kerry outlined, he says, as possible parameters that can help bring peace and a two-state solution. Real quickly, I'll go through a couple. He mentioned Resolution 242, the UN resolution that provides for secure borders between Israel and Palestine based on the 1967 lines. This was something that was also in the UN resolution voted on Friday. He talked about a solution to the Palestinian refugee crisis, Jerusalem being the capital of both a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. That was an important point, and also satisfying Israel's security needs and ending the conflict and outstanding claims that will ultimately enable the peace talks, a peace process, and two-state solution. He said, Kennedy, that the two-state solution is in serious jeopardy because of the seemingly endless occupation and settlement expansion into East Jerusalem and the West Bank. That was really the focus of the bulk of his speech, and he defended the vote Friday, saying it was about preserving a two-state solution and that it was drafted by Egypt, and that while the U.S. said that it wouldn't block it if it was a balanced resolution, he rejected the claims that the U.S. was behind it. And that's what Israeli officials continue to maintain, that the U.S. basically orchestrated and drafted this. And a senior Israeli official told me Friday that the resolution is, quote, just the tip of the iceberg as far as U.S.-Palestinian collusion. Whether they stick to that hardline approach and stance, we'll see. We're awaiting reaction. Kennedy.
All right, very good, John. Thanks so much, and we look forward to further updates from you. Herman Cain, I will go to you first because this is what we keep hearing, the two-state solution, the two-state solution. So important, so repetitive from Secretary Kerry and this administration. What does the UN vote do for Israel's desire for a two-state?
Nothing. And that's one of the big fallacies here. Assuming the legitimacy of the UN resolution. If you look at the last 8 years, the United Nations has passed 20 resolutions against Israel and 4 against the rest of the world. Secondly, the problem with the two-state solution from the Palestinian standpoint is that they want it only if you ignore the 1967 lines. That is a non-starter for Israel, and I think that they ought to stay in that spot.
Ambassador John Bolton wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal recently, and he pointed out, because you would not get this from the John Kerry speech, that the two-state solution has been on, it's essentially a dead end. It's been on life support for a number of years. He said, far better to say a three-state solution. Return Gaza to Egypt and give those parts of the West Bank that Israel is prepared to cede to Jordan. And you attach Palestinian lands to real economies, not a make-believe one, and that will benefit all.
All right, so you obviously have a president with no political experience, which arguably could be his greatest strength. And he's going to have unorthodox approaches to all sorts of ways that he governs and a number of crises. And, you know, Dagan brings up Ambassador Bolton's point about a three-state solution. What do you see President-elect Trump doing with Israel as an ally? What out-of-the-box solution do you see them coming up with?
You know, I'm not quite sure, but I think we've already seen from President-elect Trump that his viewpoint on foreign policy and the measures that he will take throughout his administration are going to be drastically different than President Obama's. And we saw that even with him taking the phone call from the president of Taiwan, right? So he's already signaled a drastic change in the way that we engage with the world. And as we saw even just with the UN resolution just now, with President-elect Trump saying to Benjamin Netanyahu, look, we have Israel's back. Like, I would not do this. And also forcing Egypt to stand down as well. But, you know, this is just another example of the dysfunctional and dangerous policies of President Obama when it comes to foreign policy. Those policies, as Dagan pointed out earlier, of helping a country like Iran, who wants to bring death and destruction to Israel, who says that there will be no Israel in the next 25 years.
I want to bring Ebony in quickly.
Yet we embolden them.
We're running out of time. You were just in Israel. Is it possible to share Jerusalem? Is that possible?
Possible, sure, in a theoretical sense, but from what I saw on the ground, I don't see it happening, and I think it's time that we get much more practical. I think we heard a speech today that was about theory and what if, and it's just not going to happen that way. I want to say this. You might not think President Obama's been the best friend Israel's ever had, but he did give them $38 billion, and I heard several Israelis say that they were appreciative for that component.
Amen. All right, very good.
Gave Iran $100 billion.
We have a hard break coming up. Meantime, Secretary Kerry insisting the U.S., including the Obama administration, has always had Israel's back. Is that how Israelis see it? We will debate next.
Oh, perfect.
Time and again, we have demonstrated that we have Israel's back. We have strongly opposed boycotts, divestment campaigns, and sanctions targeting Israel in international fora, whenever and wherever its legitimacy was attacked, and we have fought for its inclusion across the UN system.
Such a fighter. John Kerry, it feels like the speech is still going on, Herman Cain.
Well,
what was your big takeaway from it?
From the speech?
Other than indigestion, what did you get from the speech?
Indigestion, number one, and number two, they are trying to cover up a bad decision with a lot of rhetoric. Some of the facts may be correct, but them trying to explain it away is simply preposterous, as Dagan says.
To quote Rick Grinnell, the former spokesman at the UN, U.S. spokesman, he was on Twitter saying, it's been decades of U.S. policy to push the parties to negotiate directly. And you had John Kerry stand up there and lecture Israel on land permit approvals.
Right.
It was a lecture to Israel. And it highlighted how this administration, also the outgoing one, has turned its back on our ally.
Well, absolutely. Can we just talk about, too, how the UN's priorities and the administration's priorities are an absolute joke? You have half a million people getting slaughtered in Syria, and this is the focus to tip the scales in favor of the Palestinians and their harm our only democratic ally in the Middle East. I mean, I think this is the very reason why President-elect Trump has been so critical of the UN as well. And I think he, coming in to his presidency after January 20th, is going to take a hard look at the UN and her role in the UN as as well.
If they cared,
as he should.
if they cared about Israel and cared about our safety, they wouldn't have shipped those pallets of cash to Iran behind the backs of the American
Or
people.
helping rebuild their economy
That
as
was
well by
not a
lifting
ransom
sanctions.
payment, though. Remember,
Thank you.
The Iran deal was absolutely a disaster, and I've said that many times. I want to say this about the settlements. John Kerry, really said it, but he needed to say it much more plainly. Peace is not about these settlements. This whole thing, this is about good faith and operating in goodwill. And I understand, and Israelis will admit, at least they did to me, that they understand the controversial nature of settlements. But this is what they're saying.
Yeah.
We tried to do it on the up and up. We tried to do it according to international law. It failed us. And we see Palestine continuing to operate in bad faith. So to y'all's point, what is the incentive to then play by those rules?
Indeed.
So and I asked David Keyes that last point very directly, what will you say around this? And he said, look, we have to do what's in our best interest in the meantime until peace comes.
All right, we'll be hearing from Benjamin Netanyahu within the next hour. More Outnumbered in just a moment. Stay here. All right, we are awaiting the response from Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course we'll bring that to you the second he begins his speech. And thanks so much to Herman Cain. Herman, great job today. It was a truncated show, but there was a lot to say from the couch.
Enjoyed it, ladies. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman.
And Happy New Year to you and
To
your
all of
family.
you.
All right,
All of you.
thank you so much. All right, Ebony.
He's
Lisa,
one of my
Dagan?
favorites.
Well,
Yes.
thank you.
Dagan
Thank you.
gave him a go get him,
That was
buddy.
a sizzle.
I've known Herman a long time. He walks the talk, too.
She's branding you with her love.
Yeah.
I love it. Thank you all very much.
Exactly.
I
All right, well,
enjoyed
we are
it.
staying right here for Outnumbered Overtime. It's on the web. You can find us on Facebook.com/OutnumberedFNC. So easy to find us there. And we're going to be back on TV tomorrow at noon Eastern. Happening Now starts right now.